אתם עם SBS בעברית.
Joining us now we have Joel Burnie, who is the Executive Manager at Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, otherwise known as AIJAC. Joel, welcome to SBS Hebrew.
Thank you for having me on.
What's your initial reaction to this agreement?
It's a very tough question to answer. My emotions are very convoluted, complex, nuanced, confused. On the one hand, on the extreme, I could be as elated as everyone else in Israel that there's at least the very strong prospect of the immediate return of a handful of hostages in the first phase, up to about 35 of them. This will bring great comfort, happiness, and an end of the sheer depth of grief that the whole nation of Israel and the Jewish community globally has been facing since the atrocities of October 7. So as someone who's spent cumulatively nearly 4 months in Israel post-October 7, I've travelled there 6 times. I've heard countless stories of people impacted directly from the trauma of the hostages, not knowing the state of whether or not their loved ones are alive or not, whether or not they're being abused, raped, or even killed whilst they're in captivity. This is going to bring an end to a lot of that anguish. So on that front, I'm elated. I'm relieved, and I'm happy that they're going to be returned. On the other hand, there's a significant amount of uncertainty. There's uncertainty relating to the other hostages that will remain there after the first stage, some 60 plus odd hostages without knowing whether or not they're dead or alive. That's going to continue the psychological anguish that the Israeli people have been facing for the past 15 months. And also it still remains unclear, because the contents of the deal haven't been published, as to what the future governance structure of Gaza is.
Exactly. Hamas still remain in power.
Well, so it appears as though, without further information, as to whether or not there are any mechanisms in place, whether or not there's any type of plan, international community is going to finally get their hands dirty and get involved in this. This all remains unclear. So, as part of the deal that's been announced this morning, negotiations into the second stage of the ceasefire deal is to commence some 2 weeks into stage 1. So we're talking about another round of negotiations to come up with the conditions that, are going to be on the ground in stage 2. Now, those people in the South, they have long memories. They don't just remember the events that happened on October 7, 2023. They clearly remember the overthrow of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza in 2006. And the takeover of Gaza by Hamas, and then the subsequent rocket fire that was unleashed over 15 to 20 years before the invasion on October 7. So the questions that a lot of southern Israelis will be asking themselves: are we creating the conditions where in a year or two Hamas can rearm and start their rocket fire again for a number of years, and holding the people of the South to ransom again? So these are questions that remain unanswered. And that really goes to the essence of this bittersweet situation, where not only can we applaud the potential end of the war, hostages get to go back home soldiers get to go back home to their families, hostages get to be returned after such a terrible time. So these are very, very good things, and something that the nation needs before it can heal. But at the same time, without knowing exactly what's going to happen on the ground in Gaza and its future governance, what's going to happen with the safety and security of the people in Israel, it's a very, very tough situation.
I mean, despite all that, according to an Israeli daily newspaper poll, 88% of Israelis favour a political exchange. How much do you think that the political headwinds factored into Prime Minister Netanyahu's agreeing to this deal?
Oh, I think there was a lot of factors at play. So obviously a political solution was the only solution, because the military means had been exhausted, meaning that even if the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, knew where the hostages are physically located in the neighborhoods of the densely populated areas of Gaza, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can extract them militarily without them being executed at gunpoint by Hamas terrorists. So if there is no other way of getting the hostages out through military means, and the only way to get them out is through diplomatic or as you say, political means, then to heal the nation needs them back. The nation needed them back from day one. However, look, this is an illustration as to how much Israel as a society and as a democracy values life. It has placed the life of its citizens, of its hostages, either dead or alive, to be able to return home above the consequences, the potential consequences for the deal that they've had to strike. So I think the conditions on the ground, the contextual conditions on the ground, were the main factors as to why a diplomatic solution was pursued and ultimately agreed to. Obviously, the protest movement in Israel has been quite strong, but quite strong for a long time. So I don't think any change domestically inside Israel was the big factor. But we cannot, deny the fact that the Trump presidential win in the general in November last year altered the negotiations. I tend to think that there's a connection between the announcement of this ceasefire and the pending release of hostages to occur the day before President Trump is inaugurated for his second term.
I mean, I wanted to ask you actually about Trump. What kind of pressure could Trump actually use on Hamas if he were to come into power and nothing had changed on the deal table regarding the hostages?
Well, so there's lots of factors to that. So if you look at the international community's handling of this conflict, meaning the international community really wanted the conflict to come to an end very, very early on, but in my assessment did very, very little to nothing to actually bring it to an end. So was the United States forceful enough on Hamas and its allies to put pressure on Hamas to immediately release the hostages and put down their arms? I would suggest not. And the Australian government is added into that not enough pressure was exerted on the terrorist organisation Hamas in lots of different ways to put pressure on them to do the right thing and release the hostages as a condition of the ceasefire. So the international community became obsessed with ceasefire first and then worrying about the hostage second. So I think that in the Middle East, it is a different neighborhood to what we find ourselves in Australia. So there are different things that impact countries and their interests in the Middle East compared to Australia. So I do think that rhetoric aside, there is more that the United States can do regionally. It has leverage in the region. It has leverage against Hamas, and I think that it will find more political freedom to be able to utilize those levers more so than what the Democratic Biden administration had with its very strong pressure, not just from inside the party, but also from segments of the American community. So there's on that front. The second front is that there's a posture to be done here. So we don't know what President Trump has offered the Israelis to not push, not to force, but to assist the Israelis to come to the decision that they've come to today. Whether or not that is on the Saudi normalization front, whether or not that's on the expansion of the Abraham Accords, which President Trump was the one to initiate, to start, and to bring forward, whether or not it means further action on the Iranian nuclear facilities, we just don't know as to exactly what the Americans have promised the Israelis as well for them to have agreed to the ceasefire deal. So I think at this current stage, the deal itself is very complicated and there has lots of different things that need to happen for it to come to full fruition. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in terms of the Trump factor, I think that there was obviously a factor in bringing the parties together to come to where they are today. As to what that impact is in the next couple of weeks/months, as an analyst, I try not to predict what President Trump's going to do because I think it's dangerous territory.
But this has fallen under Biden's administration, along with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. So how much credit would you give the Biden administration over the Trump administration for handling this?
Look, I understand the question, and I've seen the commentary and the analysis on this. To be honest, I think it would be grossly unfair to judge the actions of the Biden administration pro or negatively, just looking at this as an isolated part of the past 15 months. Let's not forget that at the start of the war, President Biden very swiftly moves carrier groups into the Mediterranean, which the majority of analysts would suggest at least put a cap on the aggressiveness of Hezbollah and further Iranian proxies from entering the war at the get-go. So the impact and the involvement of the Biden administration in protecting Israel militarily, including with the two ballistic strikes from Iran in April and in September of last year, without the United States and without the Biden administration's involvement in Israel, things would be far worse than what they were. Now, I understand that there were disagreements between the Netanyahu government and the Biden administration throughout this conflict, and I'm not denying that. But to claim that all of the negotiations, including this one that's been agreed to, where the framework and the building of the framework was agreed to by the Israelis and the Americans 6 months before the general, I think it's far too simplistic to say that this is all Trump. I don't think that is a fair assessment on the Biden team. I think that this is now should be seen as a collective effort where maybe the straw that broke the camel's back was the change in administration with the rhetoric from President Trump and also his envoy. However, I don't believe that you could have had the deal done today in the detail that it was without the efforts of the Biden administration. So I don't think it's appropriate to point fingers here or there and say that one was more effective than the other. I think that you could make a very clear and sensible argument that both of them are responsible for assisting in bringing this deal to fruition.
And Joel, if we realise a successful 3-phase solution happening now in the next 6 weeks, what is an ideal sort of situation for the day after in the Gaza Strip?
Look, the ideal situation for both Palestinians and Israelis is very simple. There cannot be any role for Hamas in the future governance of Gaza. Gaza, the supply lines through the Philadelphia corridor in the Sinai with Egypt and through other means, Hamas needs to be impeded from being able to militarize the enclave again. Israel has confiscated over 100,000 military items that were found over the past 15-month campaign in Gaza. Gaza cannot become a launch pad for further aggression against Israel. Now, I will note that Hamas leaders in Qatar just today, with the announcement of the ceasefire, have not only glorified the murder and massacre and the rape of Israeli civilians that happened on October 7, but have said that it's going to happen again. So that is an untenable position to have that type of leadership and that type of organization on Israel's borders, and I don't believe that any country would tolerate that type of force and opposition force across its border. And that will echo the statements of the incoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in his confirmation ceremony yesterday. So the perfect situation for the day after is that there is a different governing structure inside Gaza to govern the civil structures and the bureaucracy. That country.
And who might that be?
That's a very good question, right? So whether or not it is some type of hybrid of Palestinian current Palestinian factions and clans that exist inside Gaza, whether or not it's a hybrid model with the assistance of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which obviously to the Israelis is not a decent solution, and we can all understand why. Let's not forget that the alleged moderates in Fatah who are controlling the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, they're paying stipends to the Hamas October 7 terrorists that killed Jews. So this is the idea that we can just put the Palestinian Authority in Gaza and then everything's all sorted. That is certainly not the case. So it's a very difficult question to answer as to who does run that, but the international community and specifically the Arab states in the region need to step up and take a bigger responsibility. They need to take responsibility not only the structural rebuilding of Gaza, which is critically important to the people that live there, but if Hamas is not going to have a future role in the governance of Gaza, somebody else needs to. And it should not be just exclusively up to Israel to find that solution. It should be up to the international community. The international community cannot stand by for the past 15 months, beating its chest, saying how woeful this conflict is and it needs to come to an immediate end, without taking the responsibility for the reconciliation, the rebuilding, and the hopeful eventual peace that will come afterwards. They need to step up. There needs to be added pressure on Palestinian civil society to not allow Hamas to come back into power, to find their own alternative, to pursue their own building of their own civil society and their own political structures to make sure that the next day is a happier day than the day before. That's on them. That's not necessarily, and it would be unfair to put that all at the feet of the Israelis.
And where does this leave us with the Northern Front and the Houthis and Iran? What's going to happen? I mean, they're all individual wars as well.
Look, they are individual components, but look, the head of the snake, and all of this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Iranian influence, which since October 7 and the Seven Front War that was unleashed on Israel, we can go around on each individual front, and Israel is in a better position now than what it was on October 7. So in terms of the next day elsewhere in the north, my estimation is that things will remain quiet. The ceasefire will hold as it's going to be tense at times, and I think that Israel will respond in kind, but there is no doubt that Hezbollah is a completely diminished organization that is nowhere near as capable militarily as what it was before. Syria is an interesting case that we are now obviously analyzing and looking at, but strategically the military position that Israel has inside Syria now, especially on the the Hermon mountain, is much better and strategically better for Israel for the time being. And let's just see, it's TBC as to what's going to happen in Syria. But in terms of Iran and their other proxies in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and also in Yemen, they have been completely weakened. So Iran no longer has as strong of an ability to export its fundamentalist ideology to regions around Israel, and it also has lost a huge amount of credibility in the region. It has also lost its own its own military air defense systems. It is highly vulnerable. It is severely weakened, and it would be up to the international community, especially the incoming Trump administration, to take advantage of the situation and the conditions that we find ourselves in, and to make sure that Iran is not able to rebuild, is not able to rearm its proxies, and that we go through this whole phase all over again in the next 5 to 10 years. It's not Israel's responsibility to stop that from happening. It's the international community's responsibility to stop that from happening.
Joel Burnie, thank you so much for joining us on SBS Hebrew.
Thank you so much for having me.